I'm Sampo, and I'd like to give you a short talk about dice and probability. And this talk is going to be in English, mostly for the reason that this is how I practiced it. But you can also ask questions in Finnish if that's more comfortable for you. I do hope you understand what I'm going to say. Now, I seriously think that probability, especially in the context of RPGs, is a criminally underrated subject. Now, you might have noticed, or maybe like more appropriately, you haven't noticed that there are practically no mentions of probability, expected values, or distributions when you read any game manuals, or most game manuals. Now, the purpose of this talk is to bridge this gap a little bit. Now, I'm not going to present many exact numbers. I think that would be counterproductive. But I would rather hope to present a general idea on how different mechanics behave, and that there is actually a difference on which in which mechanic you're actually using in your RPG. Now, first, these are my game design credentials. So I have designed no games whatsoever. But I do think there's something better, because I'm indeed a physicist. And if you follow Dr. Cooper, the physicist has a working knowledge of the entire universe and everything it contains. So you are safe in my hands. Now, first of all, here are a couple of reasons why this is indeed very important. So starting from the designer level, the designer has to make judgments on what the numbers actually mean. So for example, you have a strength score of 17, and that means something with respect of what is the probability of succeeding in a task. And when designing a game, these kind of questions must be answered constantly. Secondly, if you are a game designer, or no, not a game designer anymore, but rather a game master or dungeon master, you often design encounters for your players. And in designing these encounters, you have to make some judgments about how difficult they are going to be. And here, it helps immensely if you have an idea about how likely your players are going to succeed in the task you present. Now, thirdly, whenever you're playing a game, in a game you of course make a lot of decisions if you want to attempt something or not. And I believe in order to make a really informed choice of if you really want to attempt something, if you have some idea, even a vague idea about the probabilities, then that makes the choice more meaningful. And then finally, quite recently, I think there's been this phenomenon of different streamed games. So for example, some of you might know, for example, Critical Role. And in there, when you're watching the game, when you know the mechanics, and you see the players are going to try something truly bonkers, then you can really appreciate that they really succeeded in something very, very difficult, or maybe even failed in something very easy. And so you get something, some sort of extra enjoyment out of your watching. Now, there is a massive number of different mechanics, but our time here is limited. So I would like to focus on, sorry about this, I almost completely forgot about this slide. So, of course, the nature of the subject dictates that we have to make a couple of definitions so that we are all on the same page. These are a bit sloppy, so don't take this to the bank. But these are completely sufficient for the level of our discussion. So first of all, probability of something happening is just a fraction of all outcomes that lead to that something. So for example, we have a d20 and we want to roll a 17 or higher. So we just count that there are 4 outcomes that are 17 or higher, and that would give us probability of 4 out of 20 or 20%. Secondly, I do use the word distribution a lot. And in this context, I'm just going to say that distribution is simply a function that associates a probability with every possible outcome. Then the expected value, in this case, I'm just going to say that it is just an average of a long series. And then there is this abbreviation called RNG, which of course comes from the words random number generator. And which of course makes sense, because that is exactly what we use dice for. We use them to generate random numbers. So now, finally, we move on to the games, or rather mechanics, we are going to cover. So there are these 3, which I think they do cover quite many RPGs. So first of all, we have the so-called linear RNG, for example, D20 or D100. And these are used by games such as Dungeons & Dragons or Call of Cthulhu. Then we have a dice pool mechanic, popularized by Shadowrun, also used by Vampire, and also used by Warhammer, which is maybe not thought about it as often. Then there's this thing called dice summing. I'm not really sure if there is a proper name for that, but that's what I am going to use. And it is used by, for example, by Fate for everything. And in D&D, it is often encountered in a couple of spells, for example, Fireball, and damage in general. So, let's start with the linear RNG. Now, sorry about that. So, linear RNG, where we just roll a single die. And a very defining feature of die, well, if we assume fair dice, which I hope all you do, is that every single outcome has equal probability. Or in the jargon of probability calculation, this is called that the distribution is uniform. Now, it has quite a few nice consequences. And the first consequence is, of course, that it is quite easy to calculate what are your exact chances of succeeding. So in this case, we can simply count the number of outcomes that are good for us and multiply them by 5% in the case of D20. If you haven't noticed, I'm using a D20 as an example because I do think it's a nice example. And indeed, on the right, there is our first example of a distribution or probability distribution. It is a bit boring one. On the x-axis, we have all of the outcomes going from 1 to 20. And on the y-axis, we can read out the probability associated with each outcome, which in this case is, of course, 5%. Now, this is not very exciting, but things get a little bit more complicated when we move to a post-test, because this is, of course, a large part of almost any game, where kind of like both parties roll the dice. So in a post-test, something interesting happens. So these things get a little bit more complicated. Now, I think it's obvious to all that this is no longer a uniform distribution. Now here are the different outcomes of the opposed test, and of course when I say opposed test, I mean that I roll a d20 and you roll a d20, and then we sort of subtract them from each other. So looking at the x-axis here, we have all of the possible outcomes from minus 19 to 19, which is of course my d20 minus your d20. And not sure if this is surprising, but it might be, because of course we had a uniform distribution before, but right now we have something that is no longer uniform. But the reasoning for this is, if we think about it just a little bit, it is actually quite clear. Because if you think about in what way can we get a difference of 19? And now of course it requires that I have a roll of 20 and you have a roll of 1. There is no other way of getting to 19. But if we move to a difference of plus 18, then it's actually possible for me, okay, I can still roll a 20 and then you roll 2, or I can roll a 19 and you roll 1. So there are two different outcomes that lead to a difference plus 18. So we would expect that the probability of getting a difference of plus 18 would be twice as high as getting a difference of plus 19. And a similar logic sort of continues until we reach a point where we both roll the same number. It's the 0 point, that's the most likely. And then it's sort of just gets lower again when we go to negative modifiers or negative results. Now this is all nice, and we can get a good feel of what happens just by looking at this graph. But it's not really that helpful, because of course in RPGs we are very rarely concerned with the exact probability of getting, for example, a result of plus 5. But rather we are usually concerned with questions like, what is the probability of rolling 5 or higher? And that is a bit tedious to calculate just from this graph. It is possible, but it's a bit nasty. So I'm going to do a short intermission and introduce another way of looking into probability. And this might be familiar to some of you. And that is, of course, called the cumulative distribution. Now, if we go to Wikipedia, the Wikipedia gives you a definition that cumulative probability, or it might be some sort of cumulative probability mass distribution or something like that. But the essential idea is that it gives you the probability of getting, from your random variable, of getting a result X or lower. Now, this is, of course, the opposite of what we want in RPGs, well, usually. So I want to use the instead of this definition, I'm going to use the following. When I talk about cumulative distributions, I talk about this so-called inclusive complementary cumulative distribution, which gives you a probability of getting a result or higher. Now here I have a couple of examples. In the top right corner, we have simply the traditional cumulative distribution of a d20 die. And it is about exactly as what you would expect. If we go to the x-axis and take a look at the number 10, and then check the corresponding number on the y-axis, we see that there's probability of 50% of getting a result of 10 or lower, which of course makes sense. Then we move down to the so-called complementary, or this inclusive complementary cumulative distribution. It's a bit of a mouthful. Here again on the x-axis we can read out the number 10, and then check on the y-axis. Here we actually have a number of 55%, which might be a bit surprising until you think about it a little bit, because the reason is of course that this gives you the probability of rolling 10 or higher. And if we count on a d20 from 10 to 20, there are actually 11 outcomes, and 11 out of 20 is 55%. So now we have some new tools to work with. So let's move back to the post test. So here's the cumulative distribution of the post test. Now this is maybe a bit more informative. Here we see the same things we saw on the probability distribution. So we see that it has this gentle S shape, and this S shape has quite a few consequences. So first I want to illustrate in the following way. So I have here drawn a couple of boxes on the distribution. Now on each of the boxes, on the x-axis, each of the boxes is roughly sized like 1/3 of all of the possible outcomes. But as you can see, they are differently sized. So the take-home message from this is that the results towards the middle are actually quite a bit more likely than the results towards the edges. So for example, if you look at onto the very top left of the graph, on this box there are exactly like 1/3 of all of the results, but 80% of the time you see something larger than these results. And this might be a bit, well, I don't know, counterintuitive, but this is just a consequence of how things work. Now, of course, we often want to model the skills of our players or opponents through the addition of modifiers or bonuses. So, of course, this was all for just having a single d20 minus a single d20. And what happens when we add modifiers is, well, I think the take-home message should be that nothing happens. Or it is the kind of like the act of adding modifiers does nothing to the act of rolling dice. So the probabilities of each outcome are still the same, but then what instead changes is what happens on every outcome. So for example, I here have an example that, for example, we have a bonus of +10, and our opponent has a bonus of +7, and this of course translates to an effective modifier of +3. And again, since the probabilities stay the same, we can just simply shift the distribution 3 to the right, and then we can again read out our probability of winning from the 0 point, because assuming we win ties. So then we can read out from there. We can read out that with a +3 modifier, we win about 66% of the time, and this is different from about 52.5% of the time for just an even situation. This behavior, of course, has a few curious consequences. Now, one of the consequences, of course, that if you look at again to the top right of the graph, the difference between the probability of each outcome, if you go from, for example, like -10 to -11, the difference in probability of that happening isn't very large. So the consequence of this is that if you are quite close to your opponent in the modifiers, then each additional point in modifiers can actually be quite valuable. But if you're already, well, let's say winning, or if you're already like much better or much worse than your opponent, then small additions in your modifiers don't really make that much of a difference. And on the next slide, I have a small animation illustrating this. So here we have, essentially we just have a modifier and the probability of winning. So let's hope you can all follow this. So here we have our modifiers drops gently or even at an even pace. But as you can see, if you follow the probability of winning, that actually seems to be changing on a different pace depending on where we are on the graph. Right, so I think this was all I had to say about the linear RNG. I think it is quite a simple one to use in a model. So next we want to move on to the dice pools, where just as a reminder, for dice pool you take a bunch of dice, and then you just count the number of dice that are above a certain threshold, and then the number of those dice above the threshold is then the result of your roll. And for example, in Shadowrun, you take, for example, an outcome of 1, 3, 3, 4, 6, 6. This would net you 2 hits, where we count the number of dice that are above 5 or higher. Now, the cool thing about dice pools is that they actually do follow the probability of number of hits you're expected to get from your dice pool follows the binomial distribution. And the cool thing about this is that it is a very well-known probability distribution. So essentially, I believe that most results you would care about when designing a game or when modeling your game are already well known. So you can essentially just pick the results you need and just go with them. I also have here the point probability of getting a certain number of hits. We are not going to spend a lot of time here, just for the, let's call it, completeness sake. So here the K denotes the number of hits, N the size of the dice pool, and P the probability of getting a hit on a single die. Now I'm going to use Shadowrun as an example, so just as a reminder, we use D6s, and the probability of getting a single hit is 1/3. Now here on the right, I again have a couple of examples of differently sized dice pools. And now the first thing we notice is, of course, that these are no longer uniform distributions, so every outcome has a different probability. And there is one more further complication, and the complication is, of course, that as you can see, things do change. So we increase the number of dice in our dice pool, our probability distribution changes. So the thing here, of course, that follows is that we have to do the math for each and every probability distribution we are going to encounter in our game. Now this, I don't think these again, you're probably not gonna gain much from just these graphs. So let's take again a look at the cumulative distribution. Now first, I want to note that there is one very simple result for dice pools, and this is the so-called expected number of hits. So you simply take the number of the size of your dice pool and multiply it by the probability of getting a single hit. So again, in the case of Shadowrun, for example, you multiply it by 1/3. So for example, if you roll 12 dice, you would expect to see 4 hits. Now this is all nice and good, but the downside is, of course, that you are quite often in a situation where you require more or less hits. And then it becomes a bit difficult to estimate. Your actual probabilities of succeeding. Now, the good thing is, of course, that the behavior, of course, stays roughly the same, so we can sort of illustrate the behavior a little bit. So here are the same distributions as on the previous slide, but we have taken again the inclusive cumulative or inclusive complementary cumulative distribution. And here we see something, maybe something interesting happening. So it seems that these curves have an even more pronounced S shape than the opposed test. So we can see that we have this sort of, especially if we have a large number of dice, we have this plateau in the beginning, and then it drops very quickly, and then we end up on another plateau. And again, the way to read this graph is, for example, if we take a look at the green graph, which is 17 dice, and if you take a look at, for example, number 11, just next to the number 10, and again, as a reminder, the probability on the y-axis is the probability of getting a number of hits or higher. So, for example, for number 11, we already have a probability of in the single digits of getting 11 hits or higher. So that is something that's going to occur very rarely. So even if you have 17 dice, you are unlikely to ever see results much larger than 10. Now there's a bit of a different way of looking into this, kind of like what results are actually likely. So then I thought I had this idea that is called like this so-called 80% interval. It's not an official term in any sort of probability calculation, but rather the idea here is that we want to know which results you are likely to see 80% of the time. So the idea here is that we draw the top graph. It is drawn on the 90% point. So 90% of the time you see something. So 90% of the point, you look at which points are below the top graph. These are the results you're going to see 90% of the time. And then the bottom graph is 10% of the time. So results below the bottom graph are results that you are going to roll 10% of the time. So we see that actually the number of results in the middle is actually quite modest. And not only it is modest, it grows quite slowly. So the consequence of this is that there are, even if we increase our dice pool from 5 to 17, which is a massive change, actually the number of expected results doesn't really change that much. So most often you are going to see on a dice pool of 5, you're going to see 3 results. If we increase the number of dice to 11, you're going to most often you're going to see these 4 results in the middle. And for 17 dice, there are 5 results that take out 80% of your time. Now, what instead happens is that what those results are, of course, changes. So with 17 dice, you of course see much larger results, larger number of hits than with 5 dice. Now, at least to me, this was a bit surprising. As even if our number of dice changes dramatically, the number of expected results really doesn't change that much. Now on the next slide, I do have another animation. I'm going to show you how the sort of cumulative distribution changes when we increase the number of dice. So let's just watch for a while. So here on the final frame, there is the difference between 3 dice and 20 dice. And there is indeed for 3 dice we are quite likely to hit all of the possible results. But for 20 dice, this thing which I mentioned previously is really, really pronounced. So if you look at there's a massive number of results towards the tail end that you are probably never going to see, or only see extremely rarely. So for example, even at the 15 or higher, we are already almost at zero probability of seeing 15 or higher. Now, there are many more complications with dice pools before we even go to the question of opposed tests. And the first thing I want to illustrate is that when you add dice to your dice pool, and this is usually the traditional way we model our skills and trainings. So when we move on, when we increase dice, usually the character becomes a more well-trained, goes from novice to the master. So here we see an interesting behavior. So here we increase the number of dice we have in our dice pool. And we are in a situation where we would need to score 4 hits or more to succeed. And if you take a look at towards the very right of the graph, here we have a probability of scoring 4 hits or higher on a different sized dice pool. So we go from 5 to 7 to 9. With 5, we only have a 4% chance of getting 4 hits or higher. We go to 17, and we go to then until up to 34%. So as you can see, the change in probability of succeeding is relatively dramatic here. But something interesting happens if we look at the situation where we need only 1 single hit. So there we have a situation. Again, we similarly increase the number of dice in our dice pool. But here the probability of succeeding grows only moderately. We go only from 86 to 94 to 97% chance of getting 1 hit or more. Now this is maybe a bit surprising, but I actually think you can actually use this to model something really nice. Because I thought about the following situation. Now if you have persons who are masters and novices, and they try something simple, I think you probably agree that it is quite likely that both the master and novice can succeed in a relatively simple task. Usually meaning that the task requires you to get only a single hit. So there the additional training doesn't really get you that much benefit. But now if you move to more difficult tasks, then there the difference becomes really apparent, and there the master really overtakes the novice. I thought this was actually quite a nice thing. Now secondly, not only the +1 isn't the same, but actually if we change the difference or change the difficulty of the task, and as you might know, the difficulty of the task is usually denoted by the number of hits you need to get, need to score to succeed. Now that is also different depending on where you are in the probability distribution. So here I have an example of a cumulative distribution of 15 dice. At first we are in a situation where we only need 2 hits to succeed, and then for some reason the task becomes more difficult, and then suddenly we need 3 hits to succeed. And here on the top right of the graph, we have a difference in probability in absolute percentage. So we see that our probability of succeeding drops only by 5 percentage points, which is quite a moderate drop. But however, if we are attempting a more difficult task, where we in the beginning we already need 5 hits to succeed, then the situation becomes more difficult. We suddenly need 6 hits to succeed. Then we actually see a massive drop. It goes from we are already in the beginning we are actually favored to succeed. We have 60% chance of succeeding, but then we actually become an underdog, going to about 39% chance of succeeding. And this is actually quite an interesting behavior, which I also think might model something interesting. Because if you think about it, you have a simple task. Okay, if the simple task becomes a bit more difficult, then maybe that's not a big deal. So you are still quite likely to succeed. But if you are attempting something more difficult, then So when you're trying something more difficult, then even a small change in the difficulty has a massive effect on your actual chances of succeeding. And similarly, if we look at the tail end of the distribution, if you are trying something super unlikely, then changes in difficulty are going to sort of like still keep that super unlikely. Now the complications are just going to keep coming, because sometimes there is a situation where instead of adding and subtracting dice, you have an opportunity to choose to actually have the dice score a hit on a higher probability. So for example, if you have ever played Arkham Horror, there's a situation where you can get a blessing, which then increases your chances of getting a hit. So here we have a situation where I have drawn 3 different cumulative distributions. So one of them is just for 11 dice normal situation, we need a 5 or higher to score a hit. Then the orange graph is a situation where we have 17 dice, still needing 5 or higher to hit. And the green graph is a situation where we have 11 dice and need a 4 or higher to score a hit. Now an interesting thing happens here. I have zoomed in a bit towards the top of the graph. So here we actually see if we need a few successes, then it is more advantageous to score hits at a higher rate. But however, the interesting thing happens if you look towards the bottom right of the distribution. There the situation is that the sort of dice pool with the 17 dice and just the ordinary number needed to score a hit, there it is actually more likely, or it is better to have more dice if you try something difficult, but it is better to have a higher chance of succeeding if you try something easy. And this is a complication. I personally don't think this kind of changing the probability adds much to the game, but some games do it. So now you know something about that too. Now we finally have a chance to move on to the opposed tests, which of course add another variable of their own. So again, opposed test, we both of us have a dice pool, and we then compare the number of hits we get. So here's the first thing we want to learn about this, and of course, here note first, this is of course can be done analytically, as almost everything with the dice pools. But here on this graph on the right again, we have different situations different situations with opposed tests. So here we have going again from blue, orange to green. We have dice pools. We have 5 dice against 5, 7 against 7, and 9 against 9. So an interesting situation also happens here. It doesn't look like they really changed that much. And what happens is instead you see that the distribution gets slightly wider, but the change isn't very large. And you also see here, if you look at the very edges of the distribution, if you look at the green dots for the 9 dice versus dice, 9 dice versus 9 dice. So again here the extreme outcomes are quite unlikely. Now we can of course have a different number of dice. This is a bit of a different situation. Here we again keep the difference of dice pool at 4, but then we sort of increase the number of dice proportionally. So we sort of like add dice at a similar rate to each pool. So again we have the blue is the 4 against 8, then we have orange is 8 against 12, and then green is 12 against 16. So the behavior here is similar than before when we had an even situation, or even number of dice. This might be, again, best illustrated if we again look at the cumulative distribution. And this I actually think was a bit surprising, because even if the situations are maybe a bit more difficult, the distributions are almost the same. So again, if you kind of like think about like how many results are actually likely, it seems to be like staying almost the same. There are a few more results start to enter when we just increase the number of dice we have in the test, but they are actually surprisingly similar. Now, of course, thus far in all of these examples, we did keep the difference between our pool size and the pool size of our opponent the same. But of course, we can have different differences. And here's what happens when we actually when we actually increase the number of dice our opponent has. So here we keep our dice pool at a constant 6, and our opponent has 6, 10, 12, and 14 dice, going from blue, orange, green to red. Now what happens here is actually quite a bit something interesting. So again, if we look towards the middle of the graph, between the 20 and 80 on the y-axis, it seems here that the drop in the graph looks to be like almost constant. So as we increase the dice, so it seems that the dice have sort of like a similar benefit. And for the most part, what seems to be happening is that the shape of the curve again doesn't change that much. It seems to be like just shifting towards the left. And when this curve moves to the left, it of course means that our opponent is more likely to win. So as you can see, if we take a look at the 0 point, which is again assuming we win ties, we can read out how our probability of succeeding, or our probability of winning against this opponent, goes down as our opponent gets more dice, or as our opponent gets better. So we go from something like 48, looks like. We go something like from 48 to maybe like, looks to be about 30, maybe like 22 or 23, and then up to 17% chance of winning. So there's also an interesting lesson there at the 0 point, because it seems that as our opponent, as they get more and more dice, then actually it's sort of like they seem to have some sort of diminishing returns to their dice. Now I want to finish on the dice pools here, and then still say a couple of more things about the dice summing. And so let's get started on them then. And just as a reminder again, the dice pools, they work in such a way that you take a bunch of dice and then essentially just sum everything you get. And if you look at the probability distributions on the right, they might actually remind you a little bit about the opposed test we had earlier. And the reason why they follow a sort of like a similar distribution is exactly the same as we had in the case of the opposed test. Because again, if you think about, for example, 2 d6s, I'm here using d6 as an example. So if you take two d6s, it is, again, there is only one single way of getting an outcome of 2. You have to roll 2 once. But again, if we have an outcome of 3, we can roll 2 and a 1, or 1 and a 2. So again, we have a sort of like a similar reason for the shape of the curve. Now, there's also another thing happening, is that if we increase the number of dice, sorry about that. So we increase the number of dice, the distribution becomes wider. It of course moves to higher numbers, but also there seems to be happening this kind of thing. If you look at the green curve where you have 6 dice, it looks like the probabilities of again getting some extreme numbers towards some very small or very large numbers. The probability of that seems to be getting close to 0. And this one can also be illustrated by the cumulative distribution. So here we have a very similar behavior than in the dice pools. So we have also this S shape that is very pronounced. So we see that we have this plateau, and then it drops very quickly. And here also happens, something interesting happens. So if we are going to consider this so-called 80% interval. So we actually have, also the number of dice that you are most likely, the number of results you are most likely to see is actually stays pretty small. So in the case of 2d6, we have 6 different results that happen about 80% of the time. Then we go to 4d6, that is 8 results, and then 6d6, we have 10 results that happen about 10% of the time. And this is actually, I think, at least to me, this was also quite a bit surprising, because we would expect that if we increase the number of dice, we of course increase the number of possible results quite a lot. So for example, for 6d6, I think there are I think 31, maybe if I count it right, 31 different results compared to only 11 for 2d6. So, but actually in practice, they don't behave that differently. Now, of course, we can also take an opposed test with these. And for a post test, things are, well, I will also say that the opposed tests are actually quite similar to the case of the dice pools. Here we have a similar situation. We have a dice sum of 2 versus 2, 4 versus 4, 6 versus 6, and then on the bottom left we have the traditional probability distribution. And on the top right we have again the complementary cumulative distribution. And as you can see, they are quite close to each other actually in the opposed case. So, well, maybe a bit surprising. So it seems that the situation really doesn't change that much as you increase the dice. Again, which again to me was maybe a bit counterintuitive. Now we can of course have a different number of dice, where we roll, for example, 2 dice against 3, 2 dice against 4, and 2 dice against 5. And again here, on the bottom left, again the normal probability distribution. We seem to be seeing there seems to be like only a modest change in the likely outcomes, again on the x-axis. And it seems that for the most part what happens seems to be just that instead of kind of like the probabilities or the shape of the probability distribution doesn't change that much, but rather what results are going to happen changes. So this is also illustrated on the cumulative distribution on the top right. So here again, if you look at it, our shapes are quite similar. So it looks like that if we sort of like move from one result to another, the change is quite similar in every possible case, but the curve just moves to the left, and when it moves to the left, it of course means that our opponent is more likely to win. Now, this was all I had about dice summing, and here then next I would like to maybe say a couple of things about make a sort of bit of summary. So in my opinion, the linear model, I think it's a pretty straightforward thing. It's easy to calculate and sort of also easy to do with pen and paper. And then a nice thing, or I think it is a nice thing, that calculations can actually be made on the fly at the table. Then there is this situation which can happen, which is so-called off the RNG. And what it essentially means that one party has like such a huge bonuses that the actual random element really doesn't matter. So for example, if I have a bonus that is 20 points higher than your bonus, then it really doesn't matter what is the outcome of the d20, because we can only get up to plus 20 to our modifier. So it can be, so the possibility of an automatic win is there. And then of course, if you have a very, very large numbers, then subtracting or adding them can get a bit slow. Now in dice pools, by contrast, I do think that the numbers are manageable. You're often dealing something like dice pools up to maybe 20 dice in extreme. Also, the analytical solutions are available, so you don't have to do any sort of approximations, but they can be a bit cumbersome. And then finally, the expected number of hits is very easy to calculate, so you can make some estimates quickly at the table. But then the other, or rather the exact chance of winning, that is very hard to do at the table or on the fly, unless you use some sort of computational aid, which might be a bit looked down upon. And then finally, resolution. I think resolution is quite quick, and then there is always a possibility of winning. There is still, even if it's vanishingly small for large dice pools, there is still a probability of scoring a very few hits. And then finally, for dice sum, it maybe combines some elements of the both. The actual sort of like behavior of the dice seems to be closer to the dice pool. But then on the other hand, we often combine it with modifiers. So we have this kind of like dynamics of the dice pool, but we often keep the random elements same in the game. And maybe the bad point here is that maybe the resolution can be a bit slow. Especially I think if some of you have here played a high-level D&D where the wizard throws a fireball and counts a sum of maybe 30 dice. That can take quite long. And then here's maybe a bit of a bonus slide. So the way this can be done, you can do this analytically, but it's a bit tedious. But the under part is, which you don't really need to know much math. You can just do this, you can just simulate this. Personally, I did use Python, which is completely sufficient for this. And for example, if you have a modern computer, you can easily do 100,000 trials in practically no time and just get the sort of results you want without really calculating anything. So maybe there should be a workshop on that next year, or if I remember right, there actually might have been a workshop about that last year, but that would require a time machine. So that was all I had to say. I hope you learned something. So thank you for listening, and the slides are available at the following address if you are interested. So thanks again.